Okay, Tally, welcome. Thank you. And if everybody could please mute their microphone, and we'll let Tally tell us what she does and give us all the information. So thank you, Tally, for joining us.
Thank you so much, and thank you all again. This will be a little bit repetitive because we're going to have pretty much the same presentation in English that we had yesterday in Spanish, but hopefully, again, this will just be really conversational, so whatever questions come up, hopefully it can take on sort of a form of its own, and we can have some different conversation today. So thank you again for your time yesterday. We'll try and keep it within an hour this time. I know we went a little bit over last time. But just to repeat, I'm Tally Linton. I work at Denver Children's Advocacy Center. I am a child and family therapist there. And I'm going to share my screen again so that we can get this presentation up. Let's see how this works. Okay. So we're going to talk about child abuse and neglect again, recognizing the impact of it, defining child abuse and neglect, and then tools for advocacy in the community and for prevention. So Denver Children's Advocacy Center was founded in 1995, and our mission is to prevent abuse, strengthen families, and restore childhood. So we do that with a continuum of care that starts, we try to keep children safe and prevent harm. We have a prevention curriculum that goes into schools, elementary and middle schools, and works with kids, talking about everything from safe touch to like how to be safe with knives and how to in the kitchen, and identifying safe adults and learning how to talk about unsafe situations that kids might be in. So that prevention curriculum. We have a community outreach program that goes out to different resource fairs and events, just trying to let people in the community know what resources we have available to them. We have forensic interviews on site, and we have therapy for families, for children and families who have suffered some sort of trauma. So we see a lot of kids who've experienced physical or sexual abuse, witnesses to domestic violence, some sort of traumatic death. We also have an immigrant family initiative, and through that program, we are recognizing that the political climate right now is traumatic in itself. And so through that, we're able to see children for free therapy who are experiencing any kind of stress related to immigration status. So we see a lot of kids who have parents maybe in the process of deportation, or maybe a parent in detention, parent, loved one, whatever. But any sort of stress related to that, we're seeing people in those situations for free therapy. And our therapists are, most of them are bilingual English, Spanish, and trauma specialized. And this is a picture of our campus. So it's kind of nice to have a very homey feel to the building. So the kids come in, and it really does feel like home. We do a lot of play therapy with the kids. So they just sort of feel like playrooms. So today we'll be talking about child maltreatment. We'll explore the different effects of child abuse and neglect on families, on child development, and on mental health and the long-term impacts of that. We'll try and build an understanding of how to prevent abuse and neglect as much as possible, and we'll learn about some tools and resources to become community advocates for a world without abuse. So to start off, child maltreatment is any act, intentional or not, that results in harm, the potential for harm, or the threat of harm to a child. The failure to provide for a child's needs or to protect a child from harm or potential harm is also child maltreatment. And child maltreatment can be by a parent, a caregiver, an authorized custodian of the child, like a coach, teacher, or a clergy person. So anyone that the child is sort of, whose care the child is in. Does anyone have any like additions to this definition, or thoughts, comments, questions? We talked a little bit yesterday about the fine line between discipline and abuse, and like where the line can get blurred between parents who want to discipline their children with hitting and physical punishment. And basically we'll get into a little bit more of the impact of that kind of treatment with kids, but what we've learned over time is the way that that can be harmful, and we try to encourage just different alternatives. So, you know, positive reinforcement and other sort of motivation for positive behaviors rather than physical punishment, because we know that that can have a traumatic impact on the child. So the prevalence of child abuse and neglect, we have the different types of child abuse and neglect that we can see. They can be sexual, physical, or emotional. And then neglect is actually the most frequent that we see. So that includes just not providing for the basic needs, not providing enough food, not caring for the hygiene of a child, just sort of denying those basic needs. That we can see it was 59% of the cases of the reports that were found. So what happens is when people are making reports about a suspected case of abuse or neglect, that case is then passed through sort of a vetting system at the Child Protective Services, and they decide whether or not to investigate the case. So we always talk about how, as providers, it's our job to be on the lookout and try to be as safe as possible and try to just ensure that if there is any sort of likelihood or suspected abuse, that there is someone looking into whether or not anything's going on. So these numbers here just show the percentages, or sorry, that of the 3.5 million reports made, 1/4 of the reports were actually found that there was an instance of abuse going on that needed investigating. But always better to have the report and to be safe rather than sorry. So we're going to talk about the different signs of sexual, physical, and emotional abuse. There is a lot of overlap in these, and it's basically what it comes down to is looking out for any kind of significant change in behavior that can be the most significant alert that something's going on. If any of these behaviors have been there before, like if this is a long-term inability to concentrate, for example, rather than all of a sudden the child cannot concentrate. If it's a long-term issue, then maybe that doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be a sign of abuse. And of course, these behaviors can appear without it meaning that anything's going on. But noticing the change is an important way to be on the lookout. So being overly affectionate or knowledgeable in a sexual way that's inappropriate to the child's age, personality changes like becoming insecure or clingy, regressing to younger behavior patterns like thumb sucking or bringing out old toys that they had gotten rid of, a sudden loss of appetite or compulsive eating, being isolated or withdrawn, an inability to concentrate, suddenly drawing sexually explicit pictures, that's something new for the child, or trying to be super good or perfect on their best behavior, or overreacting to criticism, and erratic or frequent unexcused absences from school, difficulties paying attention, or significant learning delays that can't be explained by some other sort of medical condition. Does anyone have anything to add to this list, or questions, comments? No? Oh, no? Okay. So signs of physical abuse, there's some overlap here, but unexplained recurrent injuries or burns, or if kids have excuses that sort of don't add up as to why the injuries happened, or maybe inconsistent excuses, like one day they're saying that they bumped into a wall and the next day they're saying that they fell over. Self-destructive tendencies, like intentionally avoiding going to school, avoiding going to homework, doing homework, or even self-harm, this sort of self-destructive behavior. Aggression towards others, a fear of physical contact, so sort of recoiling or shrinking back if it looks like they're going to be touched or if they are touched. Erratic and or frequent unexcused absences from school, difficulty paying attention, and again, significant learning delays that can't otherwise be explained. So there's a lot of overlap here, but again, like the main thing to notice is just if these behaviors appear out of nowhere and if there's a big change. It's also important to know that kids can be experiencing more than one type of abuse at the same time. So it's quite frequent that if someone is experiencing sexual abuse, maybe they are also experiencing emotional or physical abuse as well, and just different combinations of all of that. And that with that, it is possible to show no signs and to not have any sort of behavioral alert that something is going on. And so that's where having conversations about safe touch and having conversations about safe adults and how to disclose anything that can be going on is very important, just to establish that that sort of safety for the child and understanding, as well as vocabulary to come forward about abuse when the signs aren't there, and sometimes they're hard to read, but we can still be on the lookout for them. So signs of emotional abuse: physical, mental, and emotional developmental lags, sudden speech disorders, continual self-deprecation, so saying that they're stupid, ugly, worthless, overreaction to mistakes, so that can be, say they mess up, they get a bad grade at school, or they are playing a sport and they aren't doing very well, and that sort of small incident becomes, well, I'm a terrible person, or I'm not worth anything, or no one loves me, no one cares about me, that sort of exaggerated overreaction. Extreme fear of any new situation, or neurotic behavior like rocking, hair twisting, or self-mutilation to sort of a compulsive degree. Does anybody have any kinds of additions to these lists of?
I have a comment. Just like yesterday, I just wanted to make sure that I say it in English as well. So in the Parents as Teachers program, we use what is called Ages and Stages Questionnaire, ASQ. So there is a question regarding the neurotic behavior, and it says something like, does your child do repetitive moves? So what I think they are referring to is, in terms of, emotional abuse, is, these type of, the description that you have here, like rocking, hair twisting, self-stimulation, that is repetitive, or it's different than just doing it because the child is having fun, or because, it's interesting to him or her, doing it several times. I think it's mostly like, this neurotic behavior that you're talking about.
Yeah, it's more, the difference is more when it becomes like a compulsion. So it's not just rocking because they're like listening to music or playing around, but more like an unable to stop sort of necessary release of energy of some sort. Yeah, cool, thanks. Yeah, so we use a questionnaire called the ACE study, which is the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. It's one of the largest investigations that assesses the associations between childhood maltreatment and then later in life health and well-being down the road. So it's a survey about child maltreatment and family dysfunction. And basically some of the, gives you a score based on how many of these experiences you've had, and then that score can give providers or parents or whoever it is information about what sort of risk the child might be at for any number of long-term sort of health or mental health impacts. So the experiences on this survey include recurrent physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, alcohol or drug use in the household, having a household member who's incarcerated, having a household member who's chronically depressed or struggling with mental health issues of their own. If there's domestic violence in the house and the child is a witness to that, having one or no biological parents at home, or just any sort of emotional or physical neglect. And so basically what's been found with this study is that people with higher ACE scores, so a higher level of this being exposed to this sort of experience, have an increased risk for heart disease, for lung disease, liver disease. The physical health impacts just from that long-term stress can be pretty significant, but also mental health-wise, just more likely to have poor coping mechanisms, or suicidal thought, or some sort of just mental health mood difficulty. So it just shows a little bit about some of the impact of what those experiences can be. So we understand that impact to be connected to brain development. And so what we know about the brain is that and I am not a scientist at all, but this is, we know that the brain develops from the bottom up and from the inside out. So all the sensory input first comes into the bottom part of the brain, and then can fill up from there. And so the brain's developing sort of step by step, and once it's developing from the brain stem, it can only go up to develop the other pieces once it's like settled and developed there first. So the brain, it's complex and plastic, so all these systems can be changed, but some of them are easier to change than others. And what happens is the bottom state, the bottom piece of the brain that develops first is the brain stem, which is where we are asking ourselves, am I safe? So when we can answer that question, that our basic needs are taken care of, that we have everything that we need, that we are physically and emotionally safe, then from there we can step up to the next sort of developmental stage, and the limbic system can develop, which is where emotions are processed, and we can ask ourselves, am I loved? And am I protected emotionally? And so once that question is able to be successfully answered, then that's when we can go on to the next step, which is to the prefrontal lobe, where we can say, what can I learn from this? And like, how can I be growing? How can I be developing? And so as one of those stages is sort of paused or delayed because of any interruption due to trauma, that's where we see that the further growth can't sort of proceed as it usually would. So more on the impact of trauma. These events are external, but they quickly become incorporated into the mind and into the body. So traumatic experiences like child abuse and neglect overwhelm a person's ability to effectively interpret and respond to danger. So going back to that development piece, when we're living down here in the, in that like, am I safe question, there's sort of a constant high alert necessity to be looking around to make sure that they're safe, and you can't step up to the next level of like emotional engagement or intellectual engagement. They generate intense negative emotional states like fear and helplessness, related, going back to just that question of if you're constantly feeling unsafe, of course you're going to be afraid and feel helpless. You can have a loss of control, a sense of vulnerability, and it can change a person's sense of self and expectations of the world. So if you feel as though the world is an unsafe place, you're going to expect it to continue being an unsafe place. And all of this, just high alert, can disrupt developmental trajectory. So unfortunately, about 1 in 7 children experience child abuse and neglect. I should have what year this is from, and I do not, but I believe it was from 2017, but I'm not 100% sure when I say that. But from the year that this study was done by the Center for Disease Control, 1 in 7 children experience child abuse and neglect. So that's a lot. And what we see is that it's having a large impact on the future violence and victimization, and just long-term health for the kids that go through these experiences throughout the trajectory of their life. So from conception through to death. So earlier, you see the impact of like social conditions and just childhood experiences and how trauma can impact childhood in that way. But then further down the line, it can lead to disrupted neurodevelopment, social, emotional, and cognitive impairment, and even through down the line to early death, just based on the physical impacts of the trauma. So some of the risk factors that we talk about with child abuse and neglect, these are just situations that typically make it more likely that a child will experience abuse or neglect. This is very complicated because this is more complex than just saying, okay, if you have this one risk factor, then you will suffer child abuse or neglect. They're very situational. There's a lot of like dynamics of, you have a lot of systems and a lot like systemic oppression sort of playing into how many of these risk factors families are exposed to. And there's a lot more involved here, but we like to mention them just because they can be sort of high alerts just to be on the lookout. So would love to have conversation about this afterwards, just with any thoughts that you all have on these risk factors. But at an individual level, we see that parents' lack of understanding of children's needs or child development and parenting skills can be a risk factor for child abuse and neglect. So if parents don't have an understanding of what their children need, how are they going to be able to give them what they need? So if they don't understand child development, if they don't understand, if they don't have a great understanding of the skills that they need to be a parent and to discipline safely, then that can be a risk factor for child abuse and neglect. Parental history of child abuse or neglect, that can be another risk factor. For example, I mentioned this story yesterday. I was working with a family where the daughter was hit, and I wound up having to make a report. She had been climbing out on the roof, and the mother wanted to make sure that she wasn't going to do that again because she wanted to protect her. She wanted her to be safe. She didn't want her to fall off the roof. So she got her daughter back in and hit her. And so I spoke to the family about having to make this report, and the mother said, well, I don't understand. Like, what else am I going to do? I don't want her to climb out on the roof. So I hit her. Like, this is because I love her. This is because I don't want her to fall off the roof. And what we learned through conversation was that this mother had grown up being hit herself. And this is what she knew. She knew that in order to discipline a child, in order to teach a child a lesson, there had to be some sort of physical consequence. And because that was how she was raised, because that was her history, she didn't have the context to imagine an alternative way to approach that situation. So in this case, that's how this became a risk factor for that family. This was, in the end, we wound up talking just about like positive reinforcement and talking with the child about where the concern is coming from and why she didn't want her to be out on the roof, and just really getting at the emotion behind the action and the emotion behind the behavior rather than going straight to the hitting. And it was a moment of sort of eye-opening and world-opening for the mother, who just couldn't, she in her worldview didn't have a concept of a way to approach that situation without physical consequence. So that was an interesting situation that comes up a lot. Substance abuse or mental health issues, including depression in the family, can be a risk factor for child abuse or neglect. We'll talk about self-care further along, but as caretakers or parents are dealing with their own challenges, if they're not able to regulate themselves, it makes it harder to react in a calm and patient way with a child when you're dealing with any sort of conflict, or even just if the child needs something. If you're sort of worked up yourself or depressed or under the influence or not taking care of yourself, it's harder to respond in a more patient way. Parental characteristics such as young age, low education, single parenthood, large number of dependent children, and low income can also be risk factors. These are not like prescriptive, like if you are a young parent, your child is likely to suffer child abuse or neglect. That's not the case, but it's just can be more common that in cases when parents are younger, when parents haven't had as much schooling, maybe they are less experienced about, less able to sort of conceptualize what the needs of the child may be, more likely to result to some sort of physical reaction. But again, that comes back down. I mean, education comes in so many different forms that these are very situational. Having non-biological or transient caregivers in the home, so like a partner doesn't have to be a mother's male partner. I don't, it could, any kind of partner who's not biological coming in and out of the house. That inconsistency that non-biological family member can create, that does tend to be a risk factor for child abuse or neglect. Parental thoughts and emotions that tend to support or justify maltreatment behaviors. So if parents are justifying more violent behaviors themselves. Then on a family level, factors that put families at risk for abuse and neglect, social isolation, family stress like separation or divorce, violence or domestic violence, any of these sorts of situations just put the child a little bit more at risk, as well as parenting stress, poor relationships, negative interactions. So we talk a lot about just sort of working on building positive relationships at home, working on communication, working on having emotional conversations and validating emotional experiences within these situations to try and decrease some of this risk. And then at a community level, when a community is one that's filled with a lot of violence, or there's a lot of disadvantage in a neighborhood like high poverty, high unemployment rates, and high density of alcohol outlets, or poor social connections. So these are just all situations that make the environment one where abuse or neglect are more likely to occur. And then when facing all these risk factors, we have protective factors as well, where basically in order to sort of not fight back, but stand up against these risk factors, we just try and amp up the protective factors to try and get kids to be in the spot where they're like best, kids and families in a spot where they're like best prepared to avoid any kind of situation that could involve abuse or neglect. So on a family level, this means protective factors can include having a supportive family environment and social networks. This is where, like, if caretakers have outlets for themselves to have support with parenting, to process their own emotional experiences outside of the family, that can just be like one step of removal from the children to avoid an in-the-moment reaction that could cause abuse or neglect. Concrete support for basic needs. So when basic needs are met, there's less stress, there is less likelihood for abuse or neglect to occur. Nurturing parenting skills, stable family relationships, household rules, and child monitoring. Can sound counterintuitive, but rules and structure and limits for children feel safe. Children need limits. They need boundaries to know like what path can they stay on, rather than going on this, well, maybe I'll come out here, maybe I'll go around there. The structure, the stability of rules is really healthy for children. And parental employment is a protective factor, as well as education, adequate housing, access to healthcare and social services. So there's a lot of, when we look at all these protective factors, there's a lot of privilege in a lot of them. There's a lot of, just like as far as access goes, for a lot of families that we work with who maybe don't have access to adequate housing, don't have access to healthcare or social services. Thinking about how we can amp up other protective factors to compensate for that is really important. So emphasizing the importance of supportive family networks and supportive community networks as well, when maybe some of these other elements are lacking. Having caring adults outside of the family who can serve as role models or mentors. That's important for support for caregivers, but as well as for children, just having supportive role models that they can turn to when they need. And on a community level, what we could do in our communities to try and increase protective factors against child abuse and neglect is just trying to find communities and provide communities with the resources to support parents and to take responsibility for preventing abuse. So really having these conversations is a way to increase protective factors. Does anyone have anything to add, or comments or questions or anything at this point?
Just wanted to add that both programs, PAT and HIPPY, are designed to support the protective factors. So the home visits that we do, the group connections, and the screenings that we do all of those activities are in place to support, you know, the protective factors. So the concrete support for in times of need, the knowledge of child development, you know, family relationships, and you know, tips for parenting. So all of those elements are present in our programs.
And additionally, Focus Points as a whole does work to make sure that the families have protective factors, whether it's, you know, parenting skills. Pretty soon we're going to have the Make Parenting a Pleasure curriculum, which is a parenting curriculum to help parents learn how to discipline their child in using different techniques, as well as how to regulate their own emotions, how to learn to calm themselves down and model that for their children. We also have a class called Familias Extraordinarias, or Extraordinary Families, talking about how as a parent you could have difficult conversations with your child, whether that is about sex, whether that is about drugs, about violence. It touches more on those difficult conversations that parents have a hard time like opening up the conversation with their children. But also, like, we have services surrounding employment, education, and other family support services as well.
Thank you.